What I'm interested in is how architecture can reassert a sense of collective identity and how the church can uniquely do that for a group of people. There is something so interesting to me about a church community that has decided to invest in its building and its architecture, because that is less and less common these days.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Two Things You Shouldn't Talk About. I'm joined this week by Amanda Iglesias. Amanda, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Josh. Such an honor to be here.
Yeah, I'm so glad to have you on, and I'm really excited to see where this conversation goes. Can you tell our guests just a little bit about who you are? You know what kind of line of work you're in, and that'll sort of reveal a little bit about the topic of our conversation tonight.
Yeah. So I'm an architect. I live in New York City. I work for a large firm that specializes in actually all sorts of building types. But I'm currently in a single family residential studio. And my specific interest is actually in sacred architecture. So churches are my specialty. I have not actually designed churches, but I've been able to grapple with the question of sacred architecture through exhibition work, writing, curation, research fellowships, etc. So that's been a constant in my life. And also, fun fact for those who are not aware, my last name is Iglesias, which is Spanish for churches.
I
So,
was actually going to ask if there
yeah.
was a connection there, or that was like some kind of inspiration, kind of hidden in the background of your mind somewhere.
Mhm. I know it's more sort of like a vocational thing. I had no interest in churches until really grad school. And then it sort of hit me, and it's become this deep well that seems to be endless. And the more I fall into it, the more I learn. And it's just this entire universe into itself. So definitely not predetermined, kind of more predestined, actually.
Yeah, it seems that way. Just it's such a funny coincidence. But
Mhm.
so what would you say kind of sparked your interest? What was that original thing that kind of sent you down this path?
Yeah. So in graduate school, I actually took a history theory seminar, and it was actually about reclaiming the role of women in modern architectural history. Behind every man, there's actually a woman. In every great firm or project, you don't have to dig too deep to realize that most of Frank Lloyd Wright's drawings were drawn by Mary Mahoney Griffith, and etc. You go one step beyond a man, and there's a woman. So part of this seminar was actually to find a woman who is not very well known, and to do the research and to understand the forces that maybe obscured her from being canonized. And I actually came across the work of a woman named Inger Exner. She's a Danish architect. She's actually still alive. She's in her late 90s, born and raised in Denmark. And she and her husband had a practice starting in the late 50s into the 90s, early 2000s. He has since passed away. And they designed 13 churches across Denmark. And it was their work on contemporary sacred architecture that just changed my life. I had never seen anything like it. The one book I had found was in Danish. So it's not well known outside of the country of Denmark. It's just extremely niche. But I just completely fell in love and said, one day I need to go visit these churches. I need to understand why they look the way that they look. And it turns out I fell into this rabbit hole where they had referenced so many projects, and they had done their work, and they knew their history. And the more I kept learning about them, the more I just unpacked this whole world of how architects think about sacred space. And that's really how it began.
So it wasn't necessarily by chance, but it definitely wasn't intentional that you ended up kind of in this sort of sphere of. I mean, were you involved in design beforehand and something like that, or was this totally different from anything you'd done before?
Right. So the way architects are educated is mainly design studios. And so the fact that this came from a history, sort of auxiliary course is interesting to me. It came by way of like kind of like extra credit course, and not through an actual design seminar or studio. And our studios are really how we cut our teeth, and we learn from architects or practitioners, and we have a site and a project scope and scale of, like we spent a whole semester developing a design. So interestingly, my love of sacred architecture has actually come by way of a history theory route, which is just atypical. And so I've learned a lot about the history of churches, but I have not yet been able to design a church, and that would be a dream one day. But those projects I've come to learn are actually extremely precious and rare, and actually considered a great opportunity for many architects if we are able to get our hands on those.
Yeah, it would certainly be a flagship project for anybody to create. Certainly, a church of. Um, when you think of churches, you think of like the focal point or the hub of a great city a lot of the time, or at least a community.
Yeah.
For me, when I get the chance to visit, especially European cities and places that are like big capital cities, it's usually one of my first stops, just because it's usually the church is like the focal point of the history and the spirituality of the community over the years. And I'm sure the opportunity to develop something of that significance, I'm sure it doesn't come that often for most people.
Hmm. Absolutely. And interesting that you say that. In the UK, the history of really English cities, that term to be qualified a city versus a town. So if you had a parish church versus a cathedral, that would have been the difference between a town and a city. So it's very much an urban differentiator as well, not just something purely architectural or symbolic, or purely tied to church history, but really shaped um, designations for or qualified as a city, which I think is very interesting. And that sort of got complicated in the Industrial Revolution when you had Liverpool and Manchester and these really, explosive cities happening up north without a proper cathedral. Um,
Right.
that's an
Even
interesting
Belfast, where I'm
juxtaposition.
from, it's
Mhm.
I was going to say Belfast is a similar situation where I think our cathedral wasn't built until 1920, although there was a smaller, I think, church on the side up until then. But I think I remember it was definitely the early 20th century was when it really took shape, and they kind of built this. I think it was like a Romanesque inspired kind of a.
Mhm.
I mean, it definitely has Gothic features on the inside, but on the outside, it's those rounded arches, and
Mhm. Mhm.
it has that sort of signature rounded look. So, like, kind of, I find those churches almost look like they're squatted a little, like they're kind of shorter and a little wider. So it has that look from the outside, but still from the inside, those the amazing kind of Gothic features of the arches, and it's almost, it looks older than it is, but it's. I think Belfast, being an industrial city primarily, was again playing catch up, like those cities you mentioned,
Mhm. Mhm.
which
Absolutely.
is interesting.
Yeah, very interesting. But granted, we don't. Our building in the street looks nothing like that. And these great cathedrals would have obviously taken much longer, but would have been the product of not only generational collaboration, but the collaboration of many guilds. And we don't have the same concept of a guild. We don't have that kind of specialization. Well, we do actually have specialization, but we don't have it in the form of gilded master apprentice type of a model. And actually, the dawn of the architect, really in the 1700s, late 1600s, did away with the guild structure. So the person of the architect is in some ways at conflict with the way that cathedrals would have been built, which would have been significantly more collaborative, and there wouldn't have been a single master visionary person who did one set of drawings. It would have been, you build a little, build a little, build a little, and then which is can be good, but then you have issues like the Siena Cathedral, in which entire portions fell apart because there wasn't a single person making sure that the structure actually made sense. So at its worst, it could be disastrous.
I know there's, I think, Which one's the one in France as well that is really significantly has significant structural issues as one of these Gothic cathedrals, but it's I think it's buckling with the kind of
Mhm.
flying buttresses didn't quite
Mhm.
work
Mhm.
the way they should have, and it was starting to kind of crumble
Right,
at sort
right,
of some key
right,
structural parts.
right. Testing the limits of vertical. I think that might be Amiens or yeah, I need to double check that, but it's
It's
definitely
Amiens or Chartres or something like that. I couldn't
sharp.
remember exactly,
Yeah.
but it's one of those ones. But it's what's interesting is it seems like none of these were really completed within the lifespan of maybe the original designer, which maybe is part of that as well. A lot of
Mhm.
these, I mean, even look at Barcelona for an example of a
Mhm.
church that's taking more than the lifetime of the designer. But it
Mhm.
seems like
Mhm.
that's a pretty common theme with these monumental churches,
Right, right.
and that probably points to this collaborative nature where it's a continuous evolving process. But is that a period that interests you particularly, these older churches? Or you mentioned it was really the more modern ones that inspired you at first, but do you have a particular period that interests you more than others at this point?
That's a really good question. My research has sort of dabbled in different periods of time. I spent a year in Cambridge actually studying the work of Sir Christopher Wren, who's a national hero and icon in England. He is um, not only the architect behind St. Paul's Cathedral in London, but the nearly 50 London city churches that he designed and oversaw after the Great Fire of 1666. So that was obviously that's 17th century, early pre-modern Britain, the kind of many who think that era represents its emergence out of the medieval into the modern as a primary world power. And so that was an interesting period of time, only because I think in many ways it reflects what a time of collective duress can do for architecture. So, in a lot of ways, yes, it's an interesting period of time historically, but there are themes that we can take and extrapolate from that period of time that actually apply after any significant world war or any significant natural disaster, which is that an institution that finds itself potentially crumbling or um, maybe stripped of power. So in Christopher Wren's time, there were periods of upheaval. I'm thinking of the Puritan revolts that ultimately did away with the monarchy for a period of time, and they abolished Parliament, and the Church of England was also abolished for a period of time. There's a lot of war and bloodshed. In order to reestablish itself, reassert itself, during the kind of glorious revolution in the 1680s, they used architecture as a primary means of doing so, of reestablishing the visibility of the church and the magnificence and the stability of the church by using a classical language, which was on par with what was happening in Europe at the time. And so I could go like on and on, like the details of that era can just, you can just fall into a rabbit trail. But what I'm interested in is how architecture can reassert a sense of collective identity and how the church can uniquely do that for a group of people. It's a polity. This is a community of neighbors. These are people who are pooling their time and their resources and doing that in an often very collaborative manner if it's in a Protestant context. And the ways that congregations do that with their buildings, I just find fascinating. Like, there is something so interesting to me about a church community that has decided to to invest in its building and its architecture, because that is less and less common these days. And so when that happens, and especially if they're hiring an architect and they're engaging in a design process and trusting them with a much more, let's say, ambitious scope, which is to design for the spirit, the spiritual dimensions, that to me is different than architecture that's motivated by the market, right, to make money, or motivated by um, power, which is, a state defined project. And so the church is an interesting opportunity that gives architects an ability to design outside of purely pragmatic or financial considerations. So Ren did that. Obviously, that was a very different period of time, but their resonance is today. And I've looked at different church building movements out really beyond World War II and into the present day, which kind of spans a lot of time and different cultures, but endlessly interesting to me.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack about, just some of the, I guess, the symbolism of that time resonating with today. I guess in the era of Cromwell, and the sort of period between the monarchies, it was it's almost like there was a renewed sort of focus on the austerity of a place of worship rather than these kind of grand. I guess it was more of a Catholic style houses of worship where there was a lot more. Um, I guess a lot more ornate and decorated, and I think it's. I'm glad that we return back to back to the era of where churches were statement pieces again, and things that went beyond like you said, beyond just function, and became actually places where people were inspired, and it wasn't just a place like a roof over their heads, if you know what I mean. It became a real statement of their really of their worship, and an illustration of their beliefs, and their an illustration of their worship to God. So it's that I see what you say there. There is like I think something similar going on today where it seems like every church is kind of using these buildings that are really more like converted shop units or warehouses or things like that, and they're really it's more about just packing people in for the cheapest price possible. So do you find that's sort of a common approach these days, where churches are really just looking for the best budget option, and something that's just to a means to an end? And why do you think that might be?
Hmm. I mean, budget is obviously top of mind. Absolutely. I think our culture, as you're saying, has moved away from sort of statement architecture. And we're increasingly suspicious of that, but that's also not a new preoccupation. That tension has existed for hundreds of years, really since the beginning of the church itself. It I mean, there's just some really interesting debates you can look up, like Abbot Sujet and um, Bernard of Cluny. There are these two kind of French religious figures who were constantly fighting about how ornate should a church be versus how austere should it be, and what does it mean to be a Christian and to be responsible with the resources. And so this was 1,000 plus years ago when they were having these conversations, but it still strikes so true to
Wow, 1,000 years ago they were talking about this kind of stuff as
absolutely.
well.
Yeah, don't quote me on the time frame, but this was in the
Hundreds
medieval
of years,
era for
yeah.
sure. And those writings are just as like invigorating and juicy to read today.
Yeah,
Um,
there's nothing new under the sun. It's all
Absolutely,
we're
yeah.
still having the same
Yeah,
debates.
there's nothing new under the sun. So, it's interesting. This is a conversation that I have with architects, especially those who are believers. And we do find an interesting paradox in which we, as designers, part of our education is traveling and going abroad, specifically to places like Rome, to draw and study and sketch church buildings as a way to learn capital A architecture. And that's so core to our education. And yet we walk into these incredible spaces with rich history and also rich church history. And yet there's no effort to necessarily put the architecture in conversation with the theology. Um, Granted, most of these churches are operating as actual places of worship, but then in some cases it can be sort of museumified. And to the point where here in the United States, we have these really historic buildings that are more or less crumbling and have, dying populations, but they have some sort of historical designation that preempts the community from being able to sell or make any significant change or alteration that would actually enhance longevity. So that's one situation. On the opposite side, where I live in New York, some of the most thriving, growing young churches are renting. They're meeting in elementary schools, they're meeting in gymnasiums, they're meeting in sort of makeshift spaces that are not capital A architecture. environments. And so the places that have the most architectural merit, those are for tourists or an aging population. And there isn't the kind of vigor that we're seeing in the younger communities that are renting. So it's
Yeah, that must be, it must be sad for you as an architect to see that sort of way of things. For the places that were created with such great intentions, and are often the places that are receiving the least attention, other than people just want to take a picture or just look around and then leave again.
yes, yeah. So it's definitely, I see it as not necessarily an issue. I'm keeping it in mind for the purpose of, architecture is always going to be a relevant and important firsthand source for any culture. So what I mean by that is we have, when we think of history, when we think of like a history book, that's like a second or third hand source. But the arts, specifically art and architecture, are a firsthand account of the main preoccupations, dreams, hopes, fears of any given people group and who they were and what was valuable to them. And so the fact that our churches are no longer, how do I say this?
That place.
That place, just it's really more of a marker, more culturally, where we're at large, that we're not putting our money there because it's not a value. And not to say that churches aren't growing and that the gospel isn't still at work in the world. It's just that there's been a shift in terms of where the money is going and where the resources are going, because architecture is just extremely capital intensive. It's very cash heavy.
Hmm. There's such a theological conflict there. I mean, I was speaking with someone, another guest from this season of our show, and we were talking a lot about monuments and statues and things like that. And there's a whole debate to be had around, statues that maybe were appropriate once upon a time, but are no longer appropriate, or are there statues that refer back to values that we once really did prioritize, and now we just, it seems like no one has a respect for those values anymore. And it seems like there's a similar kind of parallel there with churches, to where there's a real conflict between, do we go out of our way to make a monument dedicated to something that's, I guess you could say it's a uh, wasteful to, in some people's eyes, to spend so much money on something that's um, temporal, and is not, I guess, directly winning souls. People want to see a return on their investment when they give their money to the church, but at the same time, it's, there's that conflict between, I think there's an inspiration that comes from a grand space that can only be got from that type of, I guess when you walk into a cathedral, you just understand, or a church of any significance, that you understand the intent behind it, and it kind of connects you in a different way than going into kind of a darkened room with projectors. And I'm thinking of as well, you mentioned as well, post-war, there's a lot of that kind of rebuilding going on. It seems like it's been picking up pace recently, where cities, especially in Germany, I think it's Dresden, maybe, they have gone out of their way to really to bring back a cathedral that was in ruins. And I think of Coventry in England, which is still a ruin, but it's, they do certain things to kind of make sure it's still being used in some form. So perhaps there's a desire to go back, but how do you see that? I guess theologically, what's your opinion on? Do you think churches like that are worth building to this day, and just you personally?
Hmm. Well, you brought up the word monument, which I think is interesting. That that okay. I think it's important to note that the form of the church, specifically the cathedral, is something that was not core to the early church, like the apostolic church in Acts. Actually, the form of church architecture, being what it became, really started under Emperor Constantine in the 300s AD, when he sort of made Christianity the religion of empire and conflated the aspirations of empire with the the overtures of Christianity. So the Roman basilica, which was a meeting house, it was something where the emperor would sit and have civic meetings, and the populace could gather, and it was very much a civic scale of a building. That was what became adopted into what we now know as the cathedral, and that has assumed really Christ as emperor, so that the conflation of empire and Christianity replaced, Constantine, and put Christ at the head. And so that's where you see all of the iconography, all the symbolism, the hierarchy, the linear, the axial progression from the narthex into the nave, through the crossing into the altar, and then culminating with the Christ head on the east wing. So, like, all of that has so much to do with a very specific lineage that really spun off onto its own. And so I'm hesitant to say Christianity was once this, therefore it should return to this, right? Because actually before that, it was an underground church that was in a primarily domestic setting, that was subversive. It was small, it was intimate, it was a gathering of neighbors who cut across many different social lines that met across difference, and didn't actually assume any one sort of architectural style. And so the architects I'm really interested in, so Inger and Johannes Exner, who I brought, initially pulled me into this whole world, their churches in Denmark were interested in that early church model where they're interested in principles of equality and not hierarchy. They're interested in what is a purely democratic church environment look and feel like if it sort of got usurped by this imperialistic hierarchical regime that we see in really the Catholic Church with its very specific hierarchy and power structures. So they were interested in reclaiming the earliest, most democratic model of church assembly. So I bring all of that up because when you're asking my thoughts about, how churches should be maybe built today, I think there's actually so much precedent that extends outside of just what we think of as like a European cathedral. That, yes, so beautiful. We can all marvel, and I think there's something irreplaceable about a place that can generate awe and wonder, and especially in the vertical dimension, to make us feel just completely at a loss in terms of our scale in the universe and their scale compared to God. Like, that's just irreplaceable. But I think I'm interested the most in the smaller, more, say, democratic forms of church buildings that maybe are a little bit more humble, maybe take on a much more everyday material palette. They don't stick out in an urban environment. They're more subtle and introverted spaces that doesn't scream church. Like, there's nothing churchy about it, and yet you go in and there's something different. It alters your perception of what a church is and can or should be. And I think those spaces are fascinating to me because I think that reflects a really good architect who's grappling with what is a living church, what is a breathing, active church community that has a role in the modern world. And we don't necessarily need to copy paste from something that's happened in the past, because that was of its era, that was so much of its time. And we don't we are invited to reconsider the role of the church and the architecture of the church for today in the 21st century and the 22nd century. And, the church has always been at the cutting vanguard of architectural form. And why stop now? There's so much more technological progress that's been made. And I think there's a lot of opportunity that the church has yet to tap.
Mm. And again, there's a lot to unpack even in that. Just, I mean, starting with this idea that the building communicates a value system or um, I think of it like cultural priorities almost. So, you mentioned that these smaller buildings have a different um, I guess a different priority almost that they communicate, or a different key value that is kind of screams out when you see these places. Do you still find those spaces can be inspiring despite being perhaps more, you said, like kind of introverted, or maybe they don't stand out as much and aren't as obnoxious as some other buildings? But I mean, in the best possible way, churches stand out. So do you find these other buildings still have a sense of place beyond just, like I said, a roof over people's heads?
Mhm, mhm. Yes, and I so yes, because I think we have a sort of impoverished view as Westerners, especially as American. I'm an American, you're not, but like as Americans, we can tend to think a church is either um, something that meets in an elementary school gym, or a mega church that is just a black box, or a cathedral in Europe, and there's no kind of gradient in between. And I have been very intent on excavating examples of good, I would say beautiful churches that are situated in the everyday. They're not screaming, they're not lavish, they're not um, necessarily crazy expensive either. And yet there is something that is qualitatively and artistically and architecturally different. So you know it's a sacred place. You know it's a place that like invites the spirit of God really into it. And it doesn't need to be over the top either. So let me give an example, because I think the best way is to talk through examples. Again, I'm bringing up the Exners because I don't really, they're sort of in their own category. One of their churches that they are probably most known for, actually, it's outside of Copenhagen in the town of Islev, Islev. It's called the Islev Church. It's a simple square box. It's a cube, basically. There's no sort of ornament on the outside, and you would drive past it, have no idea what it is. It assumes the massing of maybe in a school or a community center, or library or something. But you walk in, and it's completely dark, and there's no windows. But the light that comes in comes actually from the roof. And what they did is they inset the roof just a foot or 2 feet. So the sunlight washes in through the interior walls. And they chose bricks that were discarded at a local brickyard that were considered irreparable, or they weren't perfect, they were mottled, they were scarred, and or maybe overly fired or something. And they chose the discarded abandoned bricks and created this wall that is completely alive with texture, and it ripples the way that the light just completely washes down. And the whole space is essentially uniform brick, and then these heavy wood timber trusses. And you walk in, and again, dark, quiet, it's cubic, so it's a pretty intimate space. The main axis is actually on a diagonal, so you're kind of walking in a diagonal, and it hits you that it's really the church of a carpenter. This is a carpenter's church. And you sit and you reflect on the person of Jesus, you reflect on his line of work, you reflect on just the craftsmanship that would have, you see the hand of the maker in this kind of a space, right? And I mean, beautiful.
Yeah, definitely profound there. And also, I mean, to me, there's a biblical parallel there with, the stone that was rejected by the builders. Maybe, I don't know if that was intentionally. I'm sure it probably was, but that's the first thing that came to my mind.
Yes, absolutely. And the more you kind of learn those details, and the more you realize just these designers, just they got it. They get what the gospel's about. They also understand what a building, how it's constructed with very thick masonry walls. Like, this is going to last 1,000 years, and it's going to patina with time. It's supposed to age. It's supposed to look older. The really contemporary spaces that are completely white with perfect corners and perfect joints, that's not going to age well. That's going to look
Right.
bad in 3 years, right?
Right. drywall and timber doesn't
Drywall,
last
yeah,
very long.
totally. That is not a church for the ages, right? But the Exners really, they did a lot of work in historical preservation. So they dealt with medieval Danish parish churches that were done in the 1000s, 1100s. So they knew construction techniques. And so they applied that to their churches in the 70s and 80s, and they still look timeless and really stop in your tracks and make you think about your own mortality,
Yeah,
like
right.
I mean, amazing environments.
So would you say then that, I guess, beyond any kind of I guess, uniform design, what you're really looking for is almost like a narrative of the building that just kind of illustrates to you that they have understood what the brief was, and that it was, it's not about a uniform style per se, but more about what's being communicated through the building. Is that kind of what you look for when you're looking for good examples?
Yeah, definitely a strong sort of narrative component, but also the process by which it gets built and designed as well is also can be a really important redemptive arc in the architectural process. So there are churches that are starting to collaborate with like local penitentiaries, and they're being built by people who are serving out their sentences and are being equipped to reemerge into the workforce, and being able to construct the building together is a redemptive story that I think the church can have a huge part in. Like, what does it mean to be a neighbor in this specific kind of a community? And it isn't just a symbolic thing that needs to be reflected in a kind of visual way, but it can also be embedded into the process of design, construction, etc. And those examples to me, I think, just really reflect a lot of possibility and potential that, again, I think is largely untapped, because I think in some ways we can be so blinded by the beauty of the Gothic cathedral, and we think that's the only way forward. But actually, there are many good case studies actually of churches and architects who are thinking strategically.
hmm I think it would be interesting to kind of think about, I guess, how the design of the building really affects what goes on within, and that's kind of what you're where we're kind of heading in that last point, in terms of the I guess it is the function of the building is the actual worship services and the church activities and those kind of things. So, and what would be interesting to do is maybe to go back to through some of those styles over the years, and maybe talk about um, if what the pros are of that design form, and then maybe some of the negatives, and then let's talk about the evolution over the years of maybe where we're heading and how values have kind of changed over the years. So I guess early Christianity, I'm assuming that's pretty much meeting in underground in people's houses, like you mentioned. But then these kind of early churches that developed into, as we said earlier, these kind of more monumental structures. It seems like, I know that's maybe not the best term, but it's certainly a, um, a statement piece. Again, I keep using that word, but it's a standout point, focal point of a city or of a community. So those kind of churches, do you see like like what would you say are the positives of that type of space for the worship service and the church activities that go on within?
Hmm. From So I'd say from a theological perspective, these churches uniquely emphasize God's transcendence, right? His largeness compared to us, his sovereignty. Um, Again, brings a lot into perspective very quickly when you walk into a cathedral that is just such an enormous volume. The transcendent aspects of of the person of God, the the scale of the gospel narrative, right? We are ushered into a narrative that is greater than ourselves. Like, there is just something beautiful and timeless and historically huge about those kinds of spaces. And yes, there is a specific hierarchy and processional component to these environments, especially when they're side chapels, and especially, you see these pilgrimage churches that have prayer chapels that lead you through the stations of the cross. And there's a participatory component that's very embodied. You're worshiping in a very bodily sense. You're sitting, you're standing. There's incense, so it's sensorial. You're smelling, and you're partaking in the Eucharist, and um, there's singing and chanting, and it's so sensorial in a way that we forget that these congregations in the Middle Ages were primarily illiterate. And so they didn't have a personal Bible. They couldn't pull up the Bible on their phone. And so every part of the church and the cathedral and the stained glass and the statuary had to tell the story to an illiterate audience and invite them to participate in a fully embodied manner that was collective and intergenerational. And that's a huge pro. I mean, I think since the Enlightenment, well, really since I would say the Reformation, there's been a divorce of the head and the body, and so a lot of theology has become increasingly an intellectual pursuit and not so much something that exists in our body as believers. So this tradition is so much more physical. Like, for example, every Holy Week, I love participating in all of the Holy Week services in a high church wherever I'm living. So when I was in the UK, it was St. Paul's. Here in New York, it's St. John the Divine. And on Good Friday, well, yeah, I could go through all the services because they're just so incredible and powerful. But Good Friday this year, the clergy, the night before, they had stripped their vestments and they had stripped the altar. And this was, Christ's abandonment at Gethsemane. And so the next day, at right before noon, and really to show appropriate respect of what was happening at the crucifixion, all of the clergy walked single file, silently, proceeded the whole space of the nave into the altar, and laid down prostrate silently for maybe 2 or 3 minutes. They were just on their faces at the altar. And then to be there, to watch that and witness that, I mean, when do you ever see anyone doing that?
Right, and
Right?
it's illustrating the liturgy of what's going on in a almost theatrical, but in the best possible way.
Mhm. Absolutely. And the reverence. And these are old, revered, these are academics and theologians. And these are people kind of to be working for, St. John the Divine, and for them to get down on their faces and lie down in front of crucified Christ. So
Hmm.
that's a pro.
Yeah, incredible. And I've had similar experiences of that because um, the the school that I went to, the high school,
Mm,
every Christmas we did our school carol service in the cathedral, and
wow.
as someone coming from I guess a non-denominational Protestant background, it was really one of my only opportunities to go and, like you said, in this kind of high church setting of a very structured liturgical but steeped in tradition. The service was obviously it wasn't a carol service; it was a festival of lessons and carols, and like it's
Yes.
a different a different way of phrasing it. But to go through that process of you read a lesson, sing a Christmas carol or hymn, and to go through and that with the reverberance of the cathedral, the everyone dressed
Mhm.
as in a way that in a traditional or not traditional non-denominational Christian church no one dresses like that at all.
Mhm.
In fact, these days you're lucky to get people wearing suits at all. So it's it was, like you said, a sensory overload compared to what I normally experienced. And I guess as well a big part of that is I was in the school choir, so it was to be up there kind of singing in the choir along with the organ. And that's something as well, a focal point of these older churches a lot of the time is the organ. And it's just something that
Mm.
is so special about that type of space that you just don't hear anywhere else, like a proper large real organ, not
Mhm.
something amplified or digital. It's just a different experience that's really hard to put into words, and
Mhm.
the music written for it is beyond anything that in a complexity way that you encounter normally, and at least I encounter normally in church these days. So I totally understand what you're saying there. It's a real experience that
Mhm.
maybe we're not having as much these days, but it was always important for me every year to go back to that, because it's just something that's so special.
Mhm. Mhm.
So it's
Yes. Yeah.
that's something that's I feel like it's something worth preserving for sure, and something that these spaces are, they still have a, I guess, a use today for that kind of a reason. And I don't know if you feel the same way, but it's there's part of it that's preserving the tradition, but it's still very much alive.
Mhm. Right. It's a living tradition, and it's, I mean, to use even like Luther's term, it's a priesthood of all believers. This is something it's inherently participatory, and I I I think there's something just irreplaceable about the space, the architecture of a well designed, well built church that facilitates these types of experiences that are, again, not motivated by the market or the state, right? Like, it's different. It's qualitatively different. And these places are increasingly rare to be able to freely encounter not only God, right, the divine, but also each other in a consistent way. Like, the space of the church does so many things for so many reasons, least of all the kind of individual sense of beauty and awe and wonder. But in our world that's increasingly privatized, how else do we get to build rich, meaningful relationships with neighbors or strangers in a consistent pattern without paying for it, without going to the gym and getting a
Right.
membership, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
so,
that community and that sort
mhm,
of
yes,
common sense of working
absolutely,
towards something.
absolutely, that those spaces are increasingly rarefied, and yet the church will keep doing that, and we'll keep doing our 9 lessons and carols. Cambridge will still do that, and every other church in the UK and worldwide even. And there's something just compelling about a uniform format that will transcend the various politics and the weatherings of our cultures. That those things will pass, but like the word of the Lord will live forever. And whether that's through song, through liturgy, through architecture, through the arts, it's like the word of the Lord is an active and real thing. And it is in the Bible, yes, but also it can be embedded
Right.
in our spaces.
And to think of the cons, I know we touched on it earlier. Perhaps the motivations of the building of this type of space, but what? Let's put it this way: what do you think we could learn from and do better when we're designing going forward? So obviously, I assume you wouldn't propose, if you were to design a church, to build a cathedral in the traditional sense. That probably wouldn't be your go-to. I'm assuming that wouldn't be your go-to. But what would you change, and what could we move away from um, regarding that type of design?
Hmm. Yeah. Well, I don't think this is something that is intentional, but there are less people who are able to construct in that kind of way. Like, to bring in so many different crafts is just fun. It's just hard. It's hard to find those skill sets that are present. Um, but I would say a, something we could learn from. I mean, definitely acoustics. Is an overriding concern, which actually there's a really interesting book called When the Church Became a Theater, and it really marks the transition between a church as a sort of formal, steeped roof, axial, in the spirit of a cathedral, basically a cruciform plan, and becoming more in the round and becoming more in step with like a proscenium arch and a stage, and really trying to maximize the
Mm.
acoustical
Like an
properties.
amphitheater.
Amphitheater type design, exactly. And so you see a movement in the 20th century away from a traditional church plan, which would be a cross, into more of a semicircle or even a square or a rectangle. And I think in some ways that's good because it's important that you can hear. But I think in some ways the over emphasis on the audio visual has created now a phenomenon in which we have these black box churches that have no concept of weather or daylight or the outdoors. Like there's no relationship to the surrounding
It's
environment.
controlled.
Extremely controlled environments, because I think we have learned from the musty, echoey, whatever, and have gone the opposite direction. Maybe I would say a little bit too far, and have sought now hyper control. But then I think we all can, many examples come to mind. These are most of the churches that I actually grew up in, and in some ways, I don't think we can have it all. I don't think we can have full control without abdicating a sense of the reverence and the mystery, the wonder that accompanies these larger cathedrals or these larger, more hierarchical environments that maybe have a much more echoey interior, but also come with a much grander sense of awe and beauty. So, I, in some ways, you can't have your cake and eat it too. Like there is a middle ground, and that's why working with architects is always a good option for church communities. I think that's something we can learn from in not only hindsight, but just really at the present day. I think the churches that are really still at the cutting edge are collaborating with not church architects, but architects who are really good listeners and can think big picture, but still understand what the heart and the intent is, and can translate that into technical, spatial, volumetric terms. And it requires trust, and it requires a community saying, we don't have a predetermined idea of what this needs to be, but we're going to entrust you with a vision. And the most productive collaborative projects that have come in the past 20 years, I would say, are when a community decides to go out on a limb and hire a really good architecture firm. And what comes of that is just so great, because it's neither, like they're finding that middle ground. Like they have a measure of control when it comes to the AV, the audiovisual, the acoustics, and yet it's not a cut and paste black box. It introduces another element of lighting and material, and there's a much more beautiful formal quality to it that elevates the spirit in a way that a Gothic cathedral will, without necessarily needing to replicate a Gothic cathedral. And just for the point of having an example, I would point someone who's like, "What is she talking about?" to look up Ripon Chapel, Ripon Chapel, in outside of Oxford, England. It's in Cuddesdon. It's part of the theological seminary, and it was designed by Neil McLaughlin Architects, who is an Irish architect. And yeah, and it is it is a small chapel for a community of nuns, and it employs sort of a thicket of glulam wood columns that are bent and create this kind of like lattice structure in the roof line. But then there's this clerestory ring of windows, so top light all washes in, and it's just this luminous, stunning tour de force of this little chapel. But again, top of the line in terms of technology. I mean, they have total control over all of the mechanical equipment, the lighting, everything. It's 21st century by and by. But um, they were they were inspired by the disciples being fishers, and so they want it to feel
Hmm.
boat-like
Right.
on the
Yeah.
inside.
That's the first thing that came to mind is like the ribbing of the
Mhm.
inside of a boat.
Absolutely. So you feel like you're kind of
Hmm.
being ushered in space and a boat, and it has that really intimate quality to it. So again, a really good architect is to be able to take ideas, take concepts that are so rich in scripture. Like we have so much, parable and allegory and just, beautiful symbolism that, I mean, goes back thousands of years. And an architect is going to listen to that and start thinking of designs. Like that's what good architects do. And we're thinking of materials, and we're thinking of site orientation and sunlight, and we're thinking of scale and all proportion. Like that's just like, yeah, we want to get into the formal qualities really quickly.
So it's
So,
still communicating, this in the same way that stained glass communicated a story. These newer buildings are doing the same thing. And I was going to ask as well. You mentioned, or you've mentioned a few times about the natural light coming in. Is that something that these black box type things are really missing? Do you think it adds something to have natural lighting coming in?
yes, as totally, always, always, always. Even
May
if,
seem like a dumb question, but obviously it's not that much of a consideration these days. Where a lot of people want to block that out.
yeah, and so I think when people hear daylighting, they think of a window, all right? They think of windows, but you can again, the Exners they brought in top light, they washed it along the periphery of the roof line. There's a chapel called the MIT Chapel, designed by Eero Saarinen, who did um, the Arch in St. Louis or Dulles Airport. He's known for sort of much more monumental buildings, but he actually did a couple churches. And this church in Boston, part of the MIT campus, it actually brings in daylight from the underside of the walls. It has these kind of rippling, wavy walls, and they're surrounded by like a moat of water on the outside of the chapel. And so sunlight bounces from the water into the chapel and it ripples upward. And so stunning. And it's like a really dark space, but you have these kind of like really ephemeral, shifting daylight type of.
I would just be sitting like
Yeah,
like just
it's
watching the ripples instead of listening in church.
totally. And you kind of walk in like want to cry because it's just it's dark but brings in light in this new and innovative. And I have so many examples of architects who are bringing in light, like Stephen Hall's Chapel, St. Ignatius in Seattle. It has these light scoops that are kind of these sculptural moments at the top that you don't ever see them, but they're colored panes of glass. So color washes into the space in this really painterly sculptural way that shifts with the Seattle, weather. So it's going to be always a little darker, a little warmer, and so again, a good architect is not going to say daylight, put a window in it, right? Like there's so many other ways to creatively usher in light in the most simple ways, especially if you don't have a good view. Like many of these black red churches are urban, maybe they're suburban, they don't have a lot of space, or they don't even have a nice view. Maybe it's a parking lot. But there are ways that you can creatively usher in light that brings you into an awareness of like there's something beyond. And I think that's what these churches do. It's like you're in it, but you're aware that there is another force at work.
I wish we had more time to talk about these issues, but maybe further down the line we can have another episode talking about some of these, some of the issues that we didn't even get to touch on tonight. So
Totally.
it's such a vast topic, and like I said earlier, there's a lot at play here: cultural issues, political issues, theological issues, all going on. So. Um, it's definitely a topic that I'm glad we were able
Mhm.
to talk about. So thank you so much for joining us, and really appreciate you taking the time out of your evening to join us tonight.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Josh. It's such an honor. I love the subject. And honestly, we could just keep talking for hours, as you're saying. It's a huge topic. So hopefully this is just a little, a little sneak preview, a little taste for anyone who's interested and even for you and your own journey. So such an honor.
And thank you to all of our listeners for watching. I really appreciate every single one of you who tuned in. Please feel free to drop a comment below if there's anything that you want to ask either of us. I can't say I'm an expert in any way, but I'll definitely pass them on to Amanda, who can answer them probably better than I ever could. But please share your thoughts below if there's anything that particularly interested you, or something that you'd want us to talk about again in the future, or a topic that's really interested you particularly. But that's all for tonight. And we'll see you next time on another episode of the Two Things You Shouldn't Talk About. Thanks for watching. Can you talk us through just a couple of examples of churches that you think are your favorites of all time?
Ooh, this is oh gosh,
Tough.
I
Sorry
know.
to put you on the spot.
Okay.